Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am joined with a special guest today, Caleb Maupin, a journalist who writes for Russia Today. So for people who don't know who you are, Caleb, could you give us a brief introduction as to who you are and what you do?
Sure. I mean, I'm a journalist, a political analyst. I come at things from a socialist and anti-imperialist perspective. I've traveled around the world. I've written a number of books. I think that pretty much sums it up.
All right. Now, you recently wrote a book about breadtube and how breadtube serves imperialism.
That's actually the title.
There you go. Breadtube serves imperialism. Now this individual front that you're a part of seems to at least be part of a broader war that began with the reporting of Aaron Mate on the use of chemical weapons in Syria, and it sort of broke on TYT. So maybe you could explain a little bit of this whole controversy about Aaron Mate.
Oh, well, I mean, my fight with breadtube goes back much further than that. But Aaron Mate is a journalist who has been critical of the allegations against the Syrian government. He doesn't buy it, and he's looked at the fact that there are emails from former members of the UN Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons that say they disagree with the results. And he doesn't buy the claim that the Syrian president is, quote unquote, gassing his own people. So therefore we should, ride in on a white horse and invade, just like in Iraq and in Libya and many other places. And I think it's good that he's questioning these claims, personally, because every time, with Libya, they used, false allegations that were later debunked to justify the intervention. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Many times we're told lies to pave the road for war. And so the fact that Aaron Mate is speaking up, I think that's a good thing for him to do. And the fact that he's been subject to this smear campaign. I mean, I've met him before, but we're not like, I can't call him on the phone. I'm not his best bud or anything, but I saw them going after him and I've tweeted in support of him. And I'm critical of Anna Kasparian, who, is supposedly a progressive, but has, kind of a record of giving softball interviews to Madeleine Albright, was not exactly playing an anti-war position when it came to Libya and some other countries, has kind of singled out Tulsi Gabbard for attack when she's one of the most clear anti-war voices, especially when it comes to Syria. So I paid attention to that controversy. That's kind of, I'm not a big player in that whole thing at all. I'm just a guy.
Now, your whole experience with breadtube begins with your appearance on Destiny. In fact, a lot of breadtubers themselves got started on Destiny, like Vaush.
Yeah.
Maybe you could sort of sketch out this entire drama over the last year of your appearance on Destiny and how you started mixing it up with breadtube.
Well, I want to start out by saying, my book is not about people, right? I have chapter 1 is called Who and What is Breadtube, and I have to talk about who they are. But most of the book is about what they think about socialism, what they think about fascism, what they think about growth and human progress. It is about ideology. I am very much a Marxist, a scientific socialist. I believe in the ideology that raised millions of people out of poverty in China, that defeated the Nazis in World War II, that invented space travel. And I see a lot of people on the internet speaking in the name of that ideology, but putting out a message that is pretty antithetical to what I believe in and what the socialist movement historically has believed in. And that's why I decided to put out the book. This isn't a personal vendetta, and many people have tried to paint it as that since it came out. So I want to preface by making clear, again, other than the first chapter, very little of the book focuses on people's personalities. It's mainly about ideas, right? It's about ideas. And if you're at all interested in socialism, even if you disagree with me, you should probably read the book and learn about the battle of ideas, learn what Marx actually said, learn what Lenin actually said, learn what fascism and what the great anti-fascist fighters of the Red Army and the Communist International, what they actually said, as contrary to what, is being put out all over the internet. But my history with breadtube, I had never heard of breadtube. But I do regular broadcasts on YouTube. I do live streams in addition to my journalism. Every Saturday before the pandemic, I would just sit in front of my bookshelf. I would open a can of unnamed diet beverage. I'm opening a can of it right now. I don't give the name of the brand. I don't, it's not product placement here. So I call it unnamed diet beverage. It's a bit of a running joke we've done on my streams. And I would just talk politics and answer people's questions about Marxism and socialism. So one day I got a random email from somebody named Caleb Kane, who has a YouTube channel called Faraday Speaks. And he introduced himself. He was a former right-winger. He's now kind of a socialist or a liberal. And he wanted me to have a debate with someone named Destiny. I never heard of Destiny. I don't play video games. Not my milieu, I guess you could say. But I mentioned to a few friends, somebody wants to debate me, a guy named Destiny. And my friends were like, Destiny wants to debate you? Oh my God. It was this, I looked him up. He was like this big celebrity. So I prepared very much for that debate, and I brought quite a bit of documentation for what I had to say. I'm used to arguing with people about socialism in the United States, and the standard argument you get is socialism has failed everywhere it's ever been tried. It's never been successful. So I came to the debate armed with UN statistics, CIA World Factbook data, New York Times articles, quotes from Ban Ki-moon, quotes from UN figures and others to defend the legacy of socialism. And Destiny and I had a 2-hour debate moderated by this Caleb Maupin individual. And people said I did pretty well. Even a lot of Destiny's fans were pretty blown away. Destiny, it never occurred to him that anyone might have an argument in defense of the Soviet Union or China or Vietnam or Cuba. He assumed that central planning has failed everywhere it's ever been tried, and that is simply not the case. Socialism, despite the human rights violations and other shortcomings, has been a very successful system around the world, raising people out of poverty, industrializing countries. And so we had a pretty good debate. And so then after that, I was just constantly getting a flood of messages from people from this internet milieu called breadtube. And I heard about ContraPoints, and I watched some of her videos, and some of them I really liked. I think she's by far the best commentator in the breadtube milieu, and I say that in the book. But there was one particular video that she did. It was called How to Spot a Fascist. And I watched this video and I thought, this is ridiculous, right? Fascism is when capitalism breaks down. It is when the capitalist system becomes so unstable that one faction of the ruling class seizes control of the government and engages in a campaign of mass political repression and destruction to save capitalism. Fascism isn't a hand gesture. It's not an aesthetic. Fascism is the breakdown of the capitalist system. It's the result of the irrationality of profit and an attempt to hold off revolution. So I saw that video. I didn't particularly like it. And then I heard about this character named Vosh, Vosh. And this Vosh character I heard about was going around on the internet saying that tankies, which is like a slur. I mean, I've tried to own it. It's a term for people who defend existing socialist countries like China, Cuba, and Venezuela. That tankies are the equivalent of Nazis, right? That if you defend existing socialist countries, you're the same as a white supremacist or a Ku Klux Klansman. And I heard that he was saying that, and I was just outraged because, some of the most anti-racist fighters in U.S. history were tankies, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, kind of the most well-beloved African-American scholar of the early 20th century, was an admirer of Stalin, an admirer of Mao. The Black Panthers went to North Korea and sent delegations to North Korea and published editions of Kim Il-sung's writings. Mao's Little Red Book was studied by revolutionaries all over the world. Nelson Mandela was an admirer of Fidel Castro and an admirer of Gaddafi and an admirer of Stalin. So to equate people on the left, even if you disagree with them, disagreement is fine, but to equate people on the left who defend the legacy of existing socialism with Nazis is vehemently offensive to me and my comrades. So I tweeted at Vosh, and one thing led to another, and we had a debate. And in that debate, Vosh proceeded to make his accusation that I was a Nazi, that I was a white supremacist because I didn't agree with some of the claims about China because I questioned them. And he called me a genocide denier. And I said, Vosh, I'm not denying anything because I don't have enough information to deny anything. I'm saying I don't trust what Adrian Zenz and mainstream media is saying about it. That's all I'm saying. But after that, Vosh repeated on his streams over and over again that I'm a, quote, literal Nazi. When I've spent years as an anti-racist activist, I attended, I went to court with police brutality victims in Cleveland long before Black Lives Matter, was tweeted out. I was part of the planning of Occupy Wall Street. I have a long record as a progressive, both domestically and internationally. So I'm subject to this whole campaign of being a fascist, but my audience was expanding because a lot of other people don't particularly care for breadtube. People want to hear socialism now. People want to hear anti-capitalism and anti-racism now, but people don't particularly like what Vosh and ContraPoints and some of these other people have to say. So the more I looked into it, I thought this breadtube milieu is quite interesting because I've been going to protests for years, never seen any of these people. The way they talk is not the way anarchists and socialists and communists have generally talked, for the past 100 years. But then what was the icing on the cake was that I was given a news tip from a source I cannot disclose. And the news tip I was given was that a certain individual named Steve Hassan, who is the leading cult expert and deprogrammer in the United States, has been working as an advisor to some of the breadtube personalities. After January 6th, he went on CNN, Steve Hassan did, and hinted that there might need to be a need for a mass deprogramming of the country from what he refers to as the cult of Trump. So based on that, I thought I had the premise of a book. And so I wrote this book, BreadTube Serves Imperialism. It is the #1 new release on Amazon.com in the category of anarchism. It has been hovering around the top 10, the top 20 in the category of communism. This is probably the most successful book I've ever written. It's only been out for 2 weeks. Hundreds of copies have sold. People are tweeting about it. There's a lot of people wildly misrepresenting the content, and that's to be expected. And that's one thing I noticed about the BreadTube milieu, and that I specifically call out in the book, right? Because on BreadTube, everyone you disagree with, they can't just be wrong. They're all part of this secret Nazi Donald Trump conspiracy that seized hold of the US government. And the problem isn't really capitalism. It's just all this vast, secret, diabolical plot of white nationalists who've infiltrated the US government. And if we can just purge the US government of these secret, Nazi crypto-fascist conspirators, everything will be all right. Well, no, the problem is rooted in capitalism. The Trump movement, the anti-immigrant bigotry, the anti-Islamic sentiments, the demagogy. The problem is capitalism. And this idea that if we just purge capitalist society of this problematic group of individuals, everything will be okay. That sounds a lot like anti-Semitism to me, right? That's what anti-Semites say. They say the problem isn't capitalism, the problem isn't imperialism. Oh, the problem is just the Jews. And if we just purge the Jews, everything will be okay. Well, no, the problem is capitalism. There is a scientific Marxist understanding of the crisis we're in as a society, and that needs to be revived because that's really the only thing that points to the way out of the crisis. So that's why I wrote the book.
Now, I read the book before interviewing you today, and one of the things that seems to be the basic thread, and you correct me if I misread it, is you begin by pointing out the British counter-gang strategy against the Mau Mau in Kenya, and you're arguing that BreadTube is best understood as a counter-gang being produced by the military-industrial complex or the intelligence agency working behind the scenes through, as you said, Hassan, this anti-cult personality who has CIA connections. You mentioned the Moonies and as a precursor of this. And you point out in a couple of places that these BreadTubers generally don't criticize U.S. activity on a foreign policy level. They generally don't criticize existing power structures within the capitalist system or the military-industrial complex, but instead will point to, say, white people in the January 6th incident and say that, well, these poor people who in your mind are being deceived by Trump are actually the problem. And then they'll ignore the Cuban, right-wing Cubans and other groups who are there. So as I understand it, your broad argument is this. This is a counter gang produced by, at least influenced by U.S. intelligence in order to create a synthetic left that doesn't really criticize the capitalist power structures. Is that a largely fair assessment?
Yes, but it's important to point out there is a big division in the ruling class right now, right? That Donald Trump was very closely tied in with some of the wealthiest capitalists in the United States, like Betsy DeVos, whose brother is Eric Prince of Blackwater. Another example is Bernie Marcus, the owner of Home Depot. A lot of the fracking companies were, very much supporting Trump. But most of the capitalists in the United States, like the owners of Walmart, like the big four super major oil companies, like, Bill Gates and Silicon Valley, most of them didn't like Trump. And that this is what happens when capitalism enters a crisis, is the ruling class fights with each other. And they recruit working people to kind of be their foot soldiers in a fight between factions. And that creates an opening for the people. I would maintain that every socialist revolution has begun this way, as a fight in the ruling class, where working people are brought into motion and then discover their own agenda and start to push their own political agenda forward. The Russian revolution was very much a fight first about whether the Tsar should stay on the throne, and then about whether Russia should continue in World War I. And the Bolsheviks maneuvered within that division in the ruling class to come to power. You could say the same for the Chinese Revolution. You could say the same for the Cuban Revolution. Even, the civil rights movement in the United States was largely about, should Jim Crow continue and how should the United States confront the Soviet Union? So divisions in the ruling class go on. There's obviously a lot of capitalists who would hate everything BreadTube stands for. The folks funding PragerU would certainly hate BreadTube. But there are other factions among the ruling class that would like what BreadTube has to say. And it's important to note, like, when I talk about Steve Hassan, so Steve Hassan, he joined the Unification Church, the Moonies, which is a religious cult that he, according to himself, I cite his interview with Jordan Harbinger, he says that they were started by the CIA, essentially, right? And he was in this group. His parents got him out of the group, and he became a deprogrammer. And he admits that to some degree or other, he was involved in involuntary deprogrammings, which was kidnapping people who were in the Moonies, holding them against their will, and trying to, quote unquote, unbrainwash them. He also admits that his mentor in this deprogramming effort is Robert J. Lifton, who's probably the most famous U.S. military psychiatrist. He's the author of a very, very famous book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. He's probably the guy who developed the concept of brainwashing more than anybody. And that some of Steve Hassan's associates even went to prison for kidnapping, one of whom was Ted Patrick, who went to prison for kidnapping people. Steve Hassan has made quite a few enemies over the years, and yet he is on mainstream media. He's treated as a cult expert. And you would think that since he was recruited into this cult that he says was started by the CIA, he would focus on opposing the American government and the CIA. But he doesn't do that. In his lectures, he focuses on demonizing Russia and China in particular. He maintains that China is the world's biggest political cult. He has taken a lot of swipes at Russia, and swipes at Russian media. He seems to be very much lined up with U.S. foreign policy. He's very close to a U.S. military psychiatrist. He hints at having inside information about his former cult and their connections to the CIA. So he's a well-connected individual. I wouldn't, he's a psychologist, but I think he has, the way I put it in the book is that he has, quote unquote, friends on the inside. And the fact that he is functioning as an advisor to BreadTube, and you can watch the interviews he does with Caleb Kane, the long stream conversation that they have. I have, on good authority that he's been talking to some of the others. If you look at that, that indicates that there are sections of the American power structure that have helped BreadTube to come along. Another example of that is the New York Times, the New Yorker magazine, the Southern Poverty Law Center. A lot of very mainstream institutions in the United States have gone out of their way to kind of give a boost to BreadTube. Not something they generally do to socialist and communist and left-wing activists. So again, this is not to say these people don't believe what they are saying, because I believe they do believe what they're saying. But it points to the fact that there are divisions in the ruling class. But what we need now is not the kind of synthetic fake socialism of BreadTube. We need scientific Marxism. We need what Marx and Engels wrote about. We need anti-imperialism. And so that's why I wrote the book, to refute their ideology and talk about the divisions in our ruling class, especially coming out of the disaster of January 6th, that shows that there are the intelligence agencies, the military-industrial complex. There's a fight going on behind closed doors that is very intense.
Now, to what extent, if any, do you see the Congress of Cultural Freedom being a precursor or influencing BreadTube today?
Well, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, now that was an entity that we now know, it's a matter of public record, that it was created by the CIA in the 1950s. And basically what happens, according to an article that was on the CIA's website until about a year ago, you can get it on the Wayback Machine, in 1949, there was an amazing conference in New York City. They called it the Waldorf Peace Conference. And Albert Einstein and Aaron Copland and Shostakovich and some of the greatest writers, scientists, actors, musicians, composers, they came to this conference in New York City at the Waldorf Hotel and defended the Soviet Union. W.B. Du Bois was there and others. And they had, at the height of McCarthyism, the height of the Cold War, they had a pro-communist peace conference. And the CIA saw this and they were just furious. They thought, how can so many smart people be sympathetic to communism, right? So based on that, they started funneling money to some left-wing anti-communists. Among them was Irving Kristol, who at that time was a Trotskyite. He later became the father of neoconservatism in the Bush years. Another one among them was Irving Howe, who went on to be one of the main founders and ideological thinkers of Democratic Socialists of America. And Hannah Arendt was among them, Mary McCarthy, Susan Sontag, and this milieu of intellectuals in New York City who were anti-Soviet but left-wing Many of them became more conservative as the 1970s and 60s went on, but started out as like Trotskyites, democratic socialists, if you will, who were getting CIA money. And they paid for a magazine called Partisan Review, which was a socialist magazine that was all over the college campuses promoting a kind of leftist critique of U.S. foreign policy and of U.S. society, but also demonizing and attacking the Soviet Union, and specifically going after artists and writers and intellectuals who did defend the Soviet Union, like Lillian Hellman. They waged a vicious campaign against Lillian Hellman, who was a communist who wrote the Broadway play The Children's Hour, which was the first Broadway play to defend LGBT rights. They went after her viciously. They went after Pete Seeger. They went after some others to trying to isolate and blacklist pro-Soviet communist voices while highlighting this kind of vague leftism. And that was the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the CIA considers it one of their most successful operations and boasts about it. It was quite successful because there was already a little bit of a gap between the Soviet Union and the Western intellectuals who were attracted to Marxism, right? The Soviet Union became somewhat of a conservative place. They outlawed homosexuality, they outlawed abortion. They became much more rigid and authoritarian. And so there was already a gap. And so the CIA realized that rather than just promoting insane, crazy anti-communism, it would be better to find communists and leftist voices who could, speak with kind of the same narrative and values, but help mobilize intellectuals around the world to oppose the Soviet Union. And that's the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And in a lot of ways, it looks like breadtube is Congress for Cultural Freedom 2.0. Now, some people have misrepresented my work and said I claim the State Department is funding breadtube. Absolutely not. If that was the case, there would be receipts. The State Department, who they give money to, is very well documented, okay? There would be receipts if that were the case, right? This is a much more covert thing. I would argue it's tied to, some powerful interests in the United States. But at the end of the day, we won't know. Now, if this is a straight up for real government operation, we might know 40 years from now. There's a very good chance it's not. It's a very good chance that just, wealthier folks that are well connected in the U.S. power structure who are afraid of Donald Trump and what he represents, which is, and that's, I don't disagree with them challenging Donald Trump. I'm not a Trump fan at all. That they have enabled these folks to rise up because they are considered a safe form of leftism. Look, these folks don't even really oppose capitalism, right? Capitalism is the rule of profits. Capitalism is a system where profits define production. These folks, they say that all they want is an employee stock ownership program, basically. They want, Vosh has said many times on his streams that under socialism, everything would be exactly the same, except every company is a cooperative, right? Instead of getting a paycheck, you just get a share of the profits, rather than a paycheck. That's all they want. They don't want to dismantle the big corporations that dominate the world. They don't want to have an economy that's organized to serve public good and not profits. They want a for-profit economy in which employees get a stock dividend rather than a wage. And that is not Marxism, and that's still capitalism. Production for profit is capitalism.
Well, and in your book, you make the point that even if you did have these cooperatives, it would just make the workers more involved in the military-industrial complex, such that if there were more wars, they would get more profits, which would actually make the problem worse.
Yeah, and the same for the prison-industrial complex. Imagine the private prisons, all the guards were shareholders. Do you think that would stop mass incarceration? Imagine that big pharma, that all the big pharma, companies, the people who manufacture the drugs or the drug salespeople and all that were equal shareholders. They would still be pushing to overprescribe opioids. Capitalism, Frederick Engels, he said capitalism is a system where the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital, meaning we don't have food so people can eat it. We have food so profits can be made from it. We don't have housing so people can live in it. We have housing so that, big banks and corporations and real estate companies can make profits from it. That's why, New York City, the rent is very, very high because the houses here are like gambling. It's, real estate speculation. They don't build apartment buildings for people to live in. They build apartment buildings to flip it and make profits. It's like gambling in a big casino. Capitalism is production organized for profit. Mao Zedong said that capitalism is profits in command. That's the way he put it. And what socialism is when the banks and the factories and the major industries are forced to work in the interest of public good. And you can have a market sector in socialism as long as you have a government controlling that market sector and forcing it to work on behalf of the public, right? Vietnam, China, Cuba now, they have a mixed economy, but at the end of the day, the Communist Party is planning out the economy and regulating very heavily the private sector. Profits are not in command. That is the difference between capitalism and socialism. Whereas Saudi Arabia, you have a lot of government involvement, but it's still a capitalist country because the government is simply facilitating the making of profits by the Saudi royal family. And that's important to make. Some people will say socialism is when the government does stuff. No. Socialism is why is production carried out. If it's for society, that is socialism. If it's for capital and the profits of capital, that's capitalism. That's the difference between the two systems.
Now, one of the charges that was made by breadtube during all this was there was a clip of you sitting next to Dugin at a conference. Yeah. And they had a field day with that. But what is the context behind that clip? What's the context there?
Well, I was in Russia in 2018 to cover the elections, and I was there, and my friend Don, who's a reporter who works in Russia, he's also from the United States, and we were invited to a conference opposing globalization. We were invited to it. I didn't even know I was speaking. Actually, I walked into the room, and they said, "Well, you'll be seated here." And so I sat there, and then they said, and then they said, try to keep your remarks under an hour. And I was like, oh, I guess I'm the speaker. So I sat next to Dugin. And honestly, though, here's the thing. Dugin and I do not agree with each other. He rejects the notion of historical progress. I do not. He opposes gay marriage and abortion. I do not. He has many views that are not my views. But to characterize Dugin as a fascist is a bit crude, right? Dugin was originally a member of the Russian Communist Party when it was founded. He wrote their constitution. He later broke with the Russian Communist Party and set up something called the National Bolshevik Party, which was considered to be, it was like a communist group that mixed in some Russian nationalist aesthetics, etc. He then broke with the National Bolshevik Party. Now he has his own think tank called the Eurasian Movement. He promotes an ideology he calls the fourth political theory. And he argues that the first political theory is liberal capitalist democracy. Communism was the first attempt to defeat it, and it failed. That fascism was the second attempt to defeat it, and it failed. And he argues that around the world right now, in Russia and in China and in Venezuela and Bolivia and in Iran and other places, that what he calls the fourth political theory is developing, which has elements of both fascism and communism in it. That's what he believes. Now, I am someone who's an adherent to what he would call the second political theory. I'm a communist, so we are not in agreement. And one of his fundamental beliefs is he believes that there is no such thing as historical progress. He says that the past, the present, and the future are equal. And we vehemently disagree about that. Historical progress is central to my worldview. But that said, Dugin is a very important thinker, not just in Russia, but around the world. Before I met Alexander Dugin, I had been to Iran. And the Iranians were talking about how Alexander Dugin is a very important thinker that has a lot of influence there. And then I went to Venezuela. And in Venezuela, I heard the same thing. And in China, I saw, he's on Chinese TV a lot, talking about, world events and such. So the opportunity to engage with him and to praise some of the good points he makes in his work is not something I'm ashamed of, but we disagree. And that's the thing. You can disagree. You know what I mean? You can disagree with people, but having traveled the world and having anti-imperialism be essential to my worldview, I'm not ashamed to have sat down next to Dugin and talked to him, and I would do it again. But it would be on the basis of we disagree, because we do disagree. I mean, his views and mine are different, but that's what we need to do, right? I am very proud to have spoken at conferences with the Nation of Islam, a Black nationalist organization, that I marched with them against the bombing of Libya. I spoke at a conference in Iran alongside members of the Nation of Islam that was dedicated to the Black freedom struggle and opposing police brutality in the United States. I've been quoted many times in the Final Call newspaper. We don't agree with each other. I'm not a Muslim, and we disagree on a number of issues, but I see them as progressive, anti-racist, anti-imperialists. And that's real organizing is different than making videos on the internet or tweeting. In real organizing, you have to be able to enter an alliance with people with whom you might disagree. You have to be able to talk to people, and you can't just cancel people, right? The problem with breadtube is that in a lot of ways, it's not really about trying to overthrow capitalism or even really win reforms. It's more about marketing socialism as a lifestyle. right? People want to be able to, put on socialist shoes, put on a socialist shirt in the morning, listen to a socialist podcast on the way to work, tell all their friends that they are a socialist. It's like a commodified identity, right? And that's the problem. We need real organizations to serve working people, because a lot of people are suffering. I was just out on the streets of New York City a few minutes ago, and the amount of homeless people I saw, the amount of hungry people I've seen, I mean, this country is falling apart in so many ways. We need real political organizing, not this silly internet shit talking.
Well, and another thing that from that clip that is also, I think, brought up by these people is, one, you've been sort of skeptical of the whole Russiagate thing with Trump and how that was reported on. And you agree with some of Trump's policies, but that seems to be unforgivable. You can't agree with some of Trump's policies. That means you must support Trump in everything.
Well, I don't know if I do I agree with Trump's policies? I think I agree with some of Trump's rhetoric, right?
That's a better way to put it.
Wars and stuff. But, I tried to be optimistic when Trump got elected. And you haven't heard the worst thing. He called me his favorite reporter by accident, a slip of the tongue, at a press conference before he got elected. I asked him a question about Russia, and before he called on me, I was the last question. And he said, all right, one more question. Who's my favorite reporter? You. And so I'm Donald Trump's favorite reporter, mind you. So it goes both ways, apparently. I'm sure it was just a silly slip of the tongue, but no, I was excited about his anti-war statements. I liked that. I liked his opposition to some of the trade deals that have devastated places like my home state of Ohio. But as president, he did an awful job. He didn't end the wars. He almost brought us to the brink of World War III by killing Qasem Soleimani. He actually escalated tensions with Russia. He ripped up all the nuclear deals, probably as a favor to his buddies in the military-industrial complex. And, the Clear Skies Agreement and, the short-range nuclear treaties were ripped apart. We're heading closer to a new arms race. Thanks to Trump. He started a trade war with China that hasn't really helped working families in the United States. There's been no benefit to working families by cutting ourselves off from the biggest economy in the world at this point. So I would say Donald Trump, he may have talked like he was some kind of populist or something, but he governed like a libertarian. He was into free markets. He was a vehement anti-communist, and his foreign policies, while he kind of talked an anti-war game sometimes, that didn't pan out either. We almost had a war with Venezuela, for goodness sakes. But you have to wonder, what could it have been worse? Was he holding things off? Was it that he was trying not to do that and was pressured to do it? We don't really know what goes on in the back room. But overall, I would give Donald Trump a big fat F as a president. He wasn't a good president at all.
Now, another element of the sort of breadtube reaction was a book you had written, or at least attributed to you in 2015, Satan at the Fountainhead, the Israel Lobby and the Financial Crisis. Now, that's a book that I don't think a lot of people have read, because on Amazon it's over $900. Yeah. So what's the actual message of that book? Because they want to say, well, that's just a Nazi code word.
Well, okay, this is really the first time I've ever talked about this book in an interview, but we'll talk about it. I figured this would come up at some point in an interview, and so we'll just talk about it. I wrote that book about the relationship between, U.S. foreign policy supporting Israel and neoliberal economics. And I specifically profiled Ayn Rand, who was, she says, the first political cause she ever donated to was Israel. And I also documented Milton Friedman and his, support of Israel. I talked about how Roosevelt, was very opposed to Israel and was also a progressive economically, and that when Roosevelt died and was replaced with Truman, that was very key in the establishing of Israel. And I talked about how Israel is tied in with the U.S. military-industrial complex and how all of these policies kind of culminated in the financial crash of 2008. After I wrote that book, and I published it as I did, I'm not Jewish, right? I'm an Irish American, and that book was very insensitive, and a number of my Jewish friends who were anti-Israel, vehemently anti-Israel, they approached me and they said, Caleb, this crossed the line. Some of the language you used here is not okay. And I felt bad about it, and I took it off the market. And that's why it costs $900, because there's only one copy of it on Amazon. And I realized that, and I do apologize to the Jewish community, which has been on the forefront of the battle against fascism, which has been on the forefront of progressive struggles like civil rights in the United States. And it was a mistake. I shouldn't have put that book out the way I did. In the future, I may re-release it under a new title and with some changes, but I would give it a new title like the relationship between Zionism and neoliberalism, or something to that effect. But the way it was released, it was made clear to me by a number of my Jewish friends that it was offensive. So I felt like I had to do the right thing and take it off the market, and I did. But let me add, the book did talk about civil rights. The book did denounce anti-Semitism throughout the book and make clear that we have to separate Zionism and and Jews, right? There are many anti-Zionist Jews, and you can't equate Israel with Jews. But it crossed the line, and I do apologize for that.
Now, one thing that you bring up in your book about breadtube is how instead of using the Marxist economic analysis to criticize capitalism, they sort of use a sort of social critique from people like Reich, Wilhelm Reich, and occult traditions, and instead of the more, again, economic Marxist socialist orientation. And that's a part of your broader thesis about being a part of the sort of anti-cult movement. So if you could get into that a little bit.
Oh, well, I mean, it's interesting because, when you talk about QAnon, like QAnon is obviously not true, right? The idea that all the ruling class are all, worshiping, they're all blood drinking Satanist pedophiles or something. That's ridiculous. But why might people be attracted to that conspiracy theory? It's because of the fact that, behind closed doors, there is a kind of, an interest in occultism among some of the rich. And that has a lot to do with the message that a lot of occultist groups put out. I talk about Aleister Crowley, who was a big occult theoretician in the 1800s. You can talk about, much more recently, Marilyn Ferguson, who was the spiritual advisor to Al Gore and a lot of people in the Clinton administration in the 1990s. They have this worldview, which is basically that the world has gotten out of balance with Mother Nature, and that there's going to be some big apocalyptic act of destruction that will correct everything. It's a very pessimistic worldview. And some of the ultra rich, that's how they see things, and they're kind of attracted to that viewpoint. And that, you can talk about the Bohemian Club, the Bohemian Grove, where a lot of the ultra rich gather. It's kind of a nude resort in California. And that the occultist worldview, generally, there are some exceptions. Like I know some feminist Wiccans who go to demonstrations and are very progressive. But within the overall occultist worldview, if you talk about Aleister Crowley, you talk about Marilyn Ferguson, you talk about Wilhelm Reich, in that milieu, there is largely a reactionary view. There's a view that says might is right. There's a focus on the individual and individual fulfillment, the releasing of sexual impulses rather than a collective solution. And that, the occult worldview is very much reactionary and opposed to what Marxism stands for. Marxism is scientific and progressive. Occultism is backward looking and individualist. But what's particularly interesting is that Marxism really emerged from the same circles where occultism originated, right? In the 1800s, you suddenly had, a new class of capitalists who had lots of free time and what they call salon culture, rich people that were kind of bored and looking to be entertained. That's where Freudian psychoanalysis comes from. And that's, Marxism originated in those circles as well. Marx did have some wealthy patrons who liked to hear what he had to say. And that kind of the curse of salon culture hangs over leftism, right? And that as Lenin and as Mao Zedong and others moved toward building mass revolutionary movements, they kind of moved away from the worldview of the kids in the pubs in Paris in Les Miserables singing "Do We Hear the People Sing." They moved toward much more of a mass progressive orientation. But Marxism, unfortunately, is stamped by some of the tendencies of salon culture and occultism and all of that, which instead of favoring, making the world better, favors some kind of explosive, cathartic act of violence to bring everything back into balance, for example. That's what I was kind of getting at there. Wagner's Ring Cycle, right, is an opera that I believe it was completed in 1874. And, it was rich people who went to operas back then, not like the common masses. And it ends with the entire world bursting into flames, and all that's left is the Rhine River, and it's, the twilight of the gods, right? And that kind of pessimistic view that we're heading towards some kind of great apocalypse, that is very, very prevalent among the breadtube milieu. We are, having very, very big problems with climate change right now. I maintain the answer is progress, fusion energy, getting beyond fossil fuels, getting to a higher mode of energy, changing the way we interact with our environment. That's the answer. The answer is not degrowth, driving down living standards, reducing the population. We need to get away from Malthusian thinking and actually understand that human beings are creative creatures. We're tool makers. And the way we solve things is by inventing new things. The first ecological crisis was about 6,000 or 7,000 years BC when we got too good at hunting and gathering. We were killing animals with spears and rocks, and we were so good at hunting and gathering that there was a scarcity. So what did we do? Did we degrow? Did we just, did we stop hunting and gathering? I mean, no, we didn't degrow. We invented agriculture, right? We started growing our own food and growing our own crops. And that's how we got beyond the first ecological crisis. Human beings have constantly changed the way they relate to their environment. And that's one of the big holes in some of this limited resources rhetoric we get, is that the whole history of human beings is changing the way we interact with our resources.
One thing that seems to be shaping up with this broader dissent within the left is what I think has galvanized it is again reporting of Aaron Mate. And it seems that you and Glenn Greenwald and Jimmy Dore have taken a very positive stance on his reporting. And you've got the Young Turks and breadtube and Kyle and Crystal who have sort of taken the opposite perspective. And what's interesting here is if you look at 2011, a lot of you people who are all protesting the capitalist system at Occupy Wall Street were on the same page. And now it seems like what's happened is there's been this rift that's developed over the last 10 years. And this is really just a spark that's a pretext or approximate cause that shows the ultimate rift. How do you read that? What do you think's the cause of that rift? What's this mean in the larger political picture?
Well, I think that there are some sections of the left, or some left-wing voices, I should say, that are more favored by the ruling class of the United States, and some that are seen as very, very threatening to the ruling class of the United States. And that, like Syria, is a pretty big red line, right? The U.S. ruling class wants to overthrow the Syrian government. The Syrian Ba'athist Arab Socialist government is an anti-imperialist government that has funded the Palestinian resistance, that is friendly to Russia and China, that refused to build an oil pipeline for the Saudis, but was trying to build an oil pipeline with Iran. And the U.S. government wants that to be overthrown. The ruling class of the United States, they're pretty clear. They want the Syrian government to fall. Whereas many anti-imperialist and progressive forces, while they may criticize Syria in relation to things like LGBT rights and relation to things like human rights and such, they see the Syrian government falling as being a situation that would be quite dangerous for the world. It would lead to a spread of, Wahhabi terrorism, ethnic tensions. I mean, it would not be a good development. Syria certainly needs reform. But it doesn't need, a situation like Iraq or Libya or Afghanistan. I mean, look how well that's turned out. And I think that's a pretty clear dividing line. I will say, though, that I think the internet kind of brings out the worst in people, because you never really know where your next alliance might be. And you have to remember, and I talk about this in the book, at the beginning of the 1930s, the socialists and the communists, or the social democrats and the communists, wanted to kill each other and did kill each other on the streets of Germany. In the United States, there was violence between them. The communists called the social democrats social fascists. The social democrats said our main enemy is on the left. And there was a blood feud between these two groups. But then when Hitler and fascism got going, suddenly they entered an alliance against fascism, right? And you had the Popular Front, where the social democrats and the communists were standing arm in arm against fascism. And you never know how things may realign. And a lot of these internet fights that get so down and dirty, and a lot of foul language, a lot of personal attacks, a lot of very extreme allegations get flown. This isn't healthy. Right? And we know that social media, the way it works is it encourages interaction, right? They want you to interact. The more you tweet, the more money they make. It doesn't necessarily mean, that all those interactions are necessarily healthy. Unfortunately, I think the internet is very good at highlighting people's differences rather than their similarities. So I'll say that as well.
Now, one thing that we see with this synthetic left, as you've described, is that people who are anti-capitalist but also not on the same page on the social issues that they're at, they're often called Strauserites, eco-fascists. A classic example would be Dukin himself, Nazbol. What do you see as driving this sort of reaction against these people?
Well, okay, so there's a couple layers to this, right? So, first of all, right, one of the main things that the Congress for Cultural Freedom did during the 1950s and 60s was try to equate the Soviet Union and its allies with the Nazis. And that was a big thing that they did, right? Arguing that the Soviet Union was just it called itself communist, but it was actually more like fascism. And as they did that, they kind of changed the understanding of what fascism actually is. For example, Hannah Arendt, who was part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom and was funded by the CIA, she wrote a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, which when I was in high school, I read that book and I loved it, right? Because it was all about how Adolf Eichmann, this Nazi war criminal, he was extradited from Argentina, taken to Israel and executed for his crimes against, during the Holocaust. Basically she attended his trial and he was an ordinary person, right? And he was just an ordinary person. She called it the banality of evil, meaning the uninterestingness or the ordinariness of evil. Basically arguing that there was nothing special about Eichmann. He wasn't a supervillain. He was just an average guy. And before he joined the Nazi Party, he was really active in the YMCA. And he liked to play sports when he was a kid. And he was just a normal guy. And it just so happened that in Nazi Germany, normal guys all became Nazis. And I read the book when I was a high school student, and I thought this is great, and this is against conformity, and it shows you need to be a rebel and question authority and all of that. But I reread the book, and it actually has a much more sinister undertone. The message is deep down, ordinary people who communists and socialists and revolutionaries are supposed to be fighting on behalf of. Deep down, ordinary people are potential Nazis. And so we need the smart intellectuals. We need the elite to control them and restrain them, because if ordinary people get together and start building mass movements and fighting for their rights, that's always the equivalent of Nazism and the Holocaust. That's kind of the message of the book. And that is very much how breadtube sees things. They don't understand fascism the way R. Palm Dutt, the leader of British Marxism, explained it. They don't understand fascism the way Georgy Dimitrov understood it. They don't have a scientific Marxist understanding of fascism. They see fascism as any form of populism, any mass movement, any mobilization of the inferior rabble who aren't smart enough to be part of their intellectual elite milieu. And whenever the rabble start getting together, it's going to lead to something awful. And in their minds, the Soviet Union is an expression of that, because the Soviet Union, it was a revolution, in which, working people rose up and seized control of the government. And so they equate that with fascism. It's an anti-populist worldview. Susan Sontag, who, wrote a particularly disturbing piece for the New York Review of Books called Fascinating Fascism. She started saying that gymnastics was fascist, that any glorification of strength is fascist, that forming mass groups of people who work together for a common cause is fascist, right? Demanding great sacrifice for a cause is fascist, right? And then Susan Sontag in the 1980s, she actually said that she thought communism was nothing but the most effective form of fascism. So this is a complete divergence from left-wing politics and left-wing understanding, and it's blatant elitism and anti-populism. And it's very dangerous because it leads to a belief that we need to control the masses of people and we shouldn't be building mass movements. That's particularly dangerous, and that's why I felt a need to call them out.
Well, this is actually a nice segue into another sticking point that your book brings up, is class reductionism. And how, and if I remember correctly, at the end of your book, when you're talking about the January 6th incident, a lot of the sort of poor working class, what we might call blue dog Democrat types that voted for Trump, some of them showed up there. And your criticism of breadtube is, they're like saying, oh, well, those people are just fascists. And you're like, no, those people need to be mobilized. And of course, class reductionism is then painted as fascism by these people. So if you could maybe get into that a little bit.
Well, look, class reductionism is a real thing. There was a communist group that I, used to go to protests with or whatever, and they sometimes at their rallies, they would chant, "White power and black power are the same. Racism is the boss's game." That's class reductionism. White power and black power are not the same. white supremacists fighting to maintain the oppression of other groups, and black people fighting for their freedom. Not the same thing at all. But if you were to equate them and say, no, it's all about class, that would be class reductionism. So actual class reductionism is a real thing. But for some reason, this term class reductionism, it's one of these phrases that has gone out. And now class reductionism is anything that focuses on economics. Okay. And no, I mean, you can talk about economics and not be belittling the struggle against racism. You can talk about economics and not be belittling what women go through or what LGBT folks go through. And this idea that whenever you talk about economics, this is somehow a slippery slope to fascism. This is one of the major delusions of breadtube, and it's particularly dangerous. And I felt a need to call that out, and I did. So there you go.
Now, I guess the last question I have for you before we wrap this up is seeing the way that the synthetic left has used these sort of tactics of guilty by association that they've used against, say, yourself or Glenn Greenwald or others. To what extent do you see this as an extension of a broader policy within the U.S. left, then turning against elements within itself?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, as I said before, this is kind of the curse of social media. But, it's kind of, it's the cancel culture, Just today, there was a group of tour guides who were protesting in Times Square, demanding, that they get their jobs back because, in light of the pandemic, all the tour bus companies have replaced the tour guides with audio recordings. And they are protesting to demand their jobs back. And so I went to their demonstration. It was very small. And I said to their guy, well, it's too bad the head of the tour bus company didn't tweet out something racist or sexist or transphobic, because then there'd be thousands of people here. And it seems like there's not an interest there's not really an interest in fighting around economic issues. There's an interest in fighting against random people who said something wrong. Okay. And the thing is, I've said wrong things in my life. I'm sure you have. We all have made mistakes before. But that's not the basis of the struggle. The struggle is not against ordinary people who say the wrong thing. The struggle should be against the system and be about mobilizing popular power and bringing people together to see their collective interest. That's what leftists are about. Cancel culture has a very different focus. In cancel culture worldview, there are good people and bad people. You discover a bad person, and then everyone pours out their hate on this bad person and gets their anger out. Often it's anger that's not really at that person. It's at hardship that they personally have suffered, and they can't actually strike back at, their boss or their family members or their parents who abused them or the bullies in school. So they strike back at some random person on Twitter or on Facebook that they think, they link with that person, and the rage comes out at this person. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really change society. And it also has the effect of making people afraid to speak out, making people afraid to raise their voices for fear they might say something wrong and then get targeted. That's really, the cancel culture stuff isn't particularly good. One thing I've noticed, when you want to talk about me, is that, I didn't write a book about people. I wrote a book about ideas. I had to introduce the people in chapter 1, but it's mainly about ideas. But yet it seems like the only way my critics can engage with me is in this personal conversation. You slammed my favorite personality. Well, that means that you're this. And you said class reductionism before. It seems like there's a list of bad people, right, that one can be. There's class reductionists. There's transphobes. There's anti-vax. And there's this list of people that are bad gets bigger and bigger and bigger every day. What if we, instead of a list of people that are bad, what if we viewed it as a list of people who we should talk to and change their position? What if we viewed it as a list of people that we maybe need to engage with? What if we viewed this, more in terms of how can we win people to a correct position? Rather than just have a list of, it's like a list of deplorables that seems to get bigger every day. And again, you put a label on somebody and they're that, and I don't want to associate with them because they're that. It doesn't really help. And also, there are a lot of people who might be wrong on one issue that have a lot of good things to say on other issues. So, when you play this game and it's just like we just throw people out, because one thing they got wrong, it's not helpful, I don't think.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the difference between engaging in straight work and engaging just on the internet. Mm-hmm. But I know and thank you for your time. It's been a really enjoyable discussion. Is there anything you'd like to end with before we wrap this up?
Not really. I do streams on my channel all the time. I'll be streaming this weekend. I'm building a think tank called the Center for Political Innovation. You can check out our website at cpiusa.org. I encourage people to get a copy of the book because everyone who's actually read the book seems to have learned something from it, but there's a lot of people who haven't read it and seem to think it's a big, long Twitter thread or something. So I would encourage you to check out the book. You may agree, you may disagree, but I think you'll enjoy it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Caleb. This is Todd Lewis of the President of Folly podcast, signing off.